I'm Zulfi Bhutta. I'm the founding director of the Institute for Global Health and Development at the Aga Khan University across its campuses in Pakistan, Central Asia, East Africa. And I also hold a chair in Global Child Health and Policy at the Center for Global Child Health at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. So I span East and West, North and South, and spend a lot of my time actually focusing on implementing many of the things for which we also undertake advocacy around child health, survival, and long-term development.
You kindly co-chaired a collection of articles to accompany the World Innovation Summit for Health 2020 conference, part of the Qatar Foundation. And the collection for the BMJ you've co-chaired is called Toxic Stress, Mitigating Childhood Adversity that Affects Lifelong Physical and Mental Health. And you co-authored some of these articles too. What are you hoping that this collection of articles will achieve?
So firstly, we were thrilled when this opportunity came up, and particularly this topic, which is seldom a focus of a summit focused on innovation and change. So as you can imagine, when this opportunity came up, one of the big challenges was how do you encapsulate such a massive global problem into succinct thought pieces that would be of relevance to the world and not just circumstances of extreme poverty in low and middle income settings or displaced populations or populations affected by conflict. And a lot of the thinking around this also preceded the global COVID pandemic. And as things would turn out, this is coming out at a time when the world's been turned truly upside down. So in the end, we are very happy with the product that we have, which is a series of thought pieces in this BMJ collection, which look at not only the definition as to what we mean by toxic stress and how do you differentiate stress from stressors themselves. What are the impacts of such exposures to adversity, and particularly at critical time periods, repeated exposures, a dose response to long-term outcomes in children, things that often have lifelong consequences and sometimes intergenerational consequences. So the first article in the series, led by Professor Charles Nelson, Chuck Nelson, who's a world authority on the subject, does a fantastic job of outlining some of the biology, the underpinning science behind explaining how toxic stress and stressors impact some of these outcomes through critical influence on developmental biology pathways, things that can have epigenetic influences, things that can lead to critical loss of opportunity for learning at critical periods in childhood. And that's a very important thought piece that lays the foundations for what is to follow.
And if I could just interrupt you, what kinds of things might lead to toxic stress? Can you give some examples of what we're talking about?
So certainly, extreme poverty, growing up in extreme poverty, creates the conditions for deprivations and some of the additional exposures that children get in such settings, such as domestic violence, particularly gender-based violence, violence that has sexual exploitation, which is the worst form of that kind of violence in childhood, exposure to drugs, exposure to adversity in relation to loss of adequate quality schooling. For many children, particularly those who have had family breakups, divorce being one example, abandonment being another extreme, the consequences of that kind of an exposure can be both a loss of a nurturing care environment where children are protected somewhat from some of these adverse influences that are part of life. There are also pre-existing conditions that reduce some of the natural resilience that many children have. For example, malnourished children don't have the same ability to respond to stress as many other children who are better nourished may have. The same can be said for children who are born with disadvantages such as premature babies, low birth weight babies who may have consequences that go on. So toxic stress can take many shapes and forms. But the worst forms of toxic stress, Richard, are those that are repetitive, that are cumulative, one on top of the other, and those that do not have adequate mitigation or supportive structures, such as a loving mother. Many children who grow in adverse circumstances, poverty being one example, grow up perfectly normal and are sometimes fabulous achievers because they have a loving parent, somebody who protects them at a critical time period. They have a wonderful teacher who is able to protect them in a school environment, or they have strong friendships and friends who provide that kind of a network. Just imagine a circumstance where none of those are available. And all you have is the influence of a drug infested neighborhood where walking out also means being bullied or harassed or actually physically abused. Growing up in that kind of a violent environment or repetitive stress environment not only inures some of these children to violence itself, but can have lifetime consequences on developmental pathways, on psychological upbeing, and physical well-being.
I mean, and that for me was one of the most fascinating parts of the stories you're telling of the articles in this collection about how this stress can cause physical health problems. Could you go into a little bit more detail about what we know, what the evidence says around the physical health problems that toxic stress can cause?
Well, at the simplest level, children who have repeated toxic stress just stop growing. We know, for example, that linear growth or growing up normally, one of the things that we do as part of our screening process is to also take a family history in terms of circumstances. Stunting in relation to mental stress in many of these children is very well described. And therefore is also very much part of the solution that if you have mental health problems in the household, particularly if the mother is stressed or exposed to violence, we recognize that those children are at much greater risk of adverse early outcomes and growth. So that's one manifestation. The other really is your ability to mount an adequate response in terms of stresses that you can have in your life, be it in the education system. So learning. So developmental pathways where children can grow and learn and partake of the opportunities that may be available to them in the education system. I mean, they are to a large extent also dependent upon some of these early toxic stresses. And then clearly, as we very well know, some of these early exposures and neurodevelopmental disruptions can be also associated with what we call epigenetic changes, things that can affect your DNA methylation, your growth in the consequences that your next generation may have in terms of your metabolic pathways. And those are only just becoming known in some ways.
So are you saying that exposure to stress can affect your DNA?
Yes, through the epigenetic pathway, which is not structural changes in the DNA, but in the ability of methylation and the metabolic programming that the DNA has for manifesting in terms of production of vital hormones, enzymes, your ability to synthesize many of these vital immunogenetic molecules that are responsible for health. So epigenetic influences are things that relate to what happens in the environment of your structural DNA, and they relate much more to these early toxic exposures. But we know that developmental trajectory, broadly speaking, in many children and many people, is so much influenced by these early biological changes, and that can determine to a large extent what you do as an adolescent, as young adults. We know that the risk of developing substance abuse, alcohol use, your ability to partake physical activity, exercise. There's so much dependent upon what your early exposure has been and what environment you've grown up with. I mean, we talk frequently about children who are exposed to domestic violence as to some or the other having a higher risk of being perpetrators of that kind of violence themselves. And this is fairly well known in the biological literature. In the worst possible scenario, Richard, if you take this in the consequences of children growing up in violent environments, particularly in conflict settings and humanitarian disasters, that effect can be existential and across generations. I wrote a piece in the BMJ about 20 years ago on Afghanistan called The Children of War, the real victims of the Afghan conflicts. And at the time when I wrote it, many of the things that I worried about and I feared because of my knowledge of the geography and people, I'm sorry to say, have come out to be true 2 decades on. Because people and children in particular, families that have grown up seeing nothing but conflict in front of them, do become inured to this, do become inured to behavior that may border on gender violence, related violence, on gender disparities that are considered normative, on behaviors and practices that are very much reflected in some of the challenges that region faces. So I think there are consequences of this early toxic stress and exposure, particularly in the sensitive time periods related to both early life, childhood, and post-infancy, that fortunately are also periods where we can have mitigation strategies. So I think one important part of our collection that I hope people will read is the good news on what works and what has worked in a variety of circumstances, but what now needs to be translated to scale. So one of the purposes in several papers of the series, so beyond the first paper that I've largely focused on so far, there's also the experience of how remedial interventions have worked in children in conflict settings and displaced populations, and a very good article on the Middle East, which has had the longest exposure to this kind of toxic stress. So the silver lining in all of this is that we do know that there are things that make a difference. And those things can be implemented in a targeted manner, but also through strategies that we are beginning to recognize now, through outreach workers, through the interface between health and education sector, social protection strategies, and importantly, some of the mitigation strategies that come from civic society organizations building the networks, the supportive networks. And one final point I would say, Richard, that, I hope that people who will read this collection will see the value in their circumstances wherever they are. So my co-chair, Nadine Burke-Harris, who's from California, has also been at pains to stress how these things are not just issues of low middle income countries and conflict settings out there in Africa, Asia, wherever these are things that we see in the inner cities and ghettos of North America, that we see with marginalized indigenous children and adolescents in Canada. So these things are real in many countries, in many populations. And mitigation strategies for these can exist in any circumstance. And I hope people will look at that to say, wow, this is something that's happening in my neighborhood. This is happening in our schools. This kind of bullying and exposure and toxic stress is something that happens to adolescent boys and girls in any circumstance, and therefore can have remedial strategies, whether you are a high-income country or whether you're a low and middle-income country.
I hope so too. It's inspiring stuff. How good is the evidence for some of the mitigation strategies? And what kind of strategies are you talking about?
So the evidence is mixed, I must say. A little of that evidence, by its very nature, is at scale. We don't have it at large-scale population levels to say, this country did this. So we have it in pockets of where people have had targeted interventions in refugee camps, for example, or through community-based organizations, civic society organizations, even from within the challenging environment of where the Rohingya refugees are in Bangladesh. There are exciting examples of civic society organizations and some of the international NGOs working with children and families in terms of reducing some of those exposures and stresses. There is a lot of evidence around nutrition interventions, and there is emerging evidence around what needs to be done with girls, particularly keeping girls in school, making sure that despite all the difficulty and challenges, that they have that support structure. Models of creating networks within communities of mentors who are working with young boys and girls in terms of holding hand and providing support. So there are those examples which are, as I said, not at scale, but they are interesting, and they are now increasingly being better documented with outcomes measures and biological measurements that give us confidence that the direction of travel is correct. So what we have made the case for in our papers is, first and foremost, there is strong evidence of prevention programs. So being aware of the possibility of some of these stresses is one of the biggest things that you can do to prevent them. It's much more difficult to handle it once it's occurred. It's much more important to prevent it in the first place. So supporting girls, keeping girls in school, ensuring that they're not exposed to measures that will lead to sexual exploitation, for example. Those are things that are natural and should be there in front of any health worker or government dealing with these things. Then we also recognize the value of community networks. So over the last several decades, both from the maternal child health survival environment, and also importantly from the toxic stress mitigation environment, we recognize the value of community support groups, particularly women's groups, an enormously important low-cost community network building intervention, which works in the same way, in many ways, as expensive group counseling sessions in London or New York for problems that many people encounter. So the evidence around their effectiveness in low and middle income countries is growing, and that effectiveness is strong in terms of building the support structures, networks, the hand-holding and the provision of a shoulder to cry on. And this can be both at the level of schools as well as the level of villages. So I think some of those are important interventions. Then we are beginning to see therapies that can be provided through caregivers at family level. We call them family-based therapies. And they relate to, in very young children, the nurturing care framework that the World Health Organization and UNICEF have put forward, which provides the opportunity to combine nutrition with loving care and an interaction with the child that helps build the matrix on which the child can have a supporting structure and optimization of growth at a very early stage. It also reduces, to some extent, the risk of exposures and infections. So we know that nurturing care, if appropriately coupled with the right kind of feeding, also reduces the prevalence of diarrhea and other infections in young children, improves their nutrition outlook, etc. And then there are, very focused, targeted individual therapies, which can reduce post-traumatic stress. But as I said, across this range of things, you will begin to see emerge a pattern that will allow people to be aware of, firstly, the risks, the risk factors, the environmental stressors that you could reduce on the prevention side. And then you couple that with things that you can do at individual level, at household and family level, increasingly at community level and village level. Now, if you put all of this together, what is now needed is greater global awareness at the level of governments, UN agencies, donors, funders. So it is possible that anytime people walk into a conflict zone or a zone where you know that there are going to be stresses, of this nature. I'll give you an example of the COVID response. In the early stages of this pandemic's response, the focus was lock down everything, stop everything, just have this extreme stringent measures because we've got to prevent infection from spreading. Sure. And it was only a couple of months later that the penny dropped that some of the indirect consequences of what we were doing were probably far worse than the cure itself that was put in place. And we've now spent the last year principally counting the dates, so to say. But we don't know the countless people who've been affected by the consequences of the mitigation strategies that were put in there. So the eye does not see what the mind does not know. So I hope that this collection will open minds and eyes to what can happen in those circumstances and should be prevented next time.
That's great. Thank you so much. The only other thing that I wondered about asking you was around climate change and how climate change intersects with this collection and what the stresses are there. What's your thinking around that, Zulfi?
So, at a macro level, what we are talking about is the interrelationship of things. So the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that have been put forward for the world, all of which has been sidelined over the last 1 year by this one pandemic, were coined and signed into a global compact in 2015 for the precise reason that there is not a single thing which is not connected with another. So if you have health outcomes as your sustainable goal 3, they're related to goal 2, which is around appropriate nutrition, poverty alleviation, goal 1, related to living conditions and your environment, climate change, sustainable development, gender parities, reduction of inequalities, so on and so forth. So the 17 goals are all individually important and they're all interrelated. What relevance does it have to our toxic stress story here? The relevance is very clear. You only get toxic stress when you have an interplay of many of these factors which come and influence living conditions, risks, and the environment in a way that increases the propensity for the toxic stress that many of these families and children encounter, and also repetitive stress. I'll give you one example to answer your question on climate change. How many people realize and recognize that behind many of the recent conflicts in the world, in fact, even if you go back behind the genesis of many of these outbreaks over the last decade, whether it's Ebola or Zika or COVID-19, are the changes in the global macro environment that are being introduced by environmental degradation, changes in lifestyle, and also climate change behind them. People don't recognize that one of the great disasters in our recent history, the Darfur conflict, was all about water reservoirs underground. The Syria conflict began because of a crisis over water supply to a particular community or city, which then inflamed everything. Many people are concerned that the next conflict between India and Pakistan may not be on Kashmir, may actually be on water resources because they're becoming so scarce. So climate change at a macro level influences everything, influences the world that we live in, influences the risk, the living conditions, the environment, and influences also many of the humanitarian crises that we are exposed to, including disasters. So while the solution may not be evident and apparent right now, if we're looking at things across the lens of generations and time, in the mitigation strategies for the toxic stress for individuals and families and children are the reduction in the toxic stress to our planet. We only have one planet that we live on. And as we look at toxic stress and stressors for ourselves individually, our immediate environment, our families and communities, one should recognize that the greatest toxic stress that we encounter is actually to our planet at large. And that is through climate change and its consequences on health, nutrition and development.
Great. Thank you so much, Zulfi. It's a pleasure speaking to you. Is there anything else you want to say to BMJ readers around the collection, around your articles, around toxic stress?
Well, please read it and share it. I think as far as I'm concerned, these articles have a huge risk of just gathering dust on bookshelves or in rubbish bins. So the articles in them by themselves mean nothing. And I think what would be really important is if any part of what we are saying in this collection, and it's a fairly wide range of things, we talk about the ghettos of New York, the stresses that we have in downtown Los Angeles, to the war situation in Yemen, in the Rohingya refugees. So we cover a very wide palette. And it's deliberate in some ways to say that the problems that we have in front of us are universal. And the solutions are also, therefore, contextual. But some things that we need to do are things that we need to do as a global community together. So I'm grateful personally that the BMJ chose to highlight this. I'm also grateful that you partnered with WISH and the World Innovation Summit for Health. I think if there is one innovation that comes out of this in terms of ensuring that we keep our eye on the basics and on the fundamental recognition of these risks, it allows us also to invest in learning more and, importantly, in doing more in terms of reducing the consequences and mitigation for this. My last point on this is I don't think we could have chosen a better time to release something like this, because the reality of COVID-19 and its impact on many of our families, children, and adolescents is in front of us. This has been indeed an extremely stressful period in the lives of many. And if you just take one message from the COVID-19 experience, which is the consequences in terms of mental health, of just a simple thing like restriction of activities and being asked to stay at home, those consequences have been enormous. The increase in number of people with mental health consequences as a result of that has been unbelievable. It's been many folds in many places, 5 to 10 folds more consultations, more recognitions of this. If that is a manifestation of a form of benign toxic stress, just imagine what families and children go through in their daily lives. If you just multiply that exposure many folds with things like actual violence, with things like actual exposure to a toxic drug environment, and to things such as undernutrition and other genetic predispositions that can compound those outcomes. So learning more about it is the first step that we need to take in terms of doing something about it. So I hope that one audience, Richard, that may benefit from this collection, who typically would not read the dense neurodevelopmental or biological literature, might be the development community. And I would like personally to see a lot more resources going into this from the well-endowed and high-income countries to try and do something about this collectively at a global landscape, particularly amongst the poorest of the poor and in conflict settings and emergencies. I mean, those are areas where we could certainly integrate some of this thinking around toxic stress reduction, the nurturing care framework for prevention and mitigation of these consequences in a much more organized way with the right kind of money, resources, and people that this field needs.
Great. Thank you so much, Zulfi, and I very much hope that the collection has the impact. I'm sure it will raise awareness in this area, and I'm looking forward to the discussions next week. But thank you so much for your time now, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.